Further crises in the Middle Ages. Plague. If famine were not enough, another one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse was on the ride: pestilence. Yersinia pestis is a bacterium which causes a disease which we know is plague. It can have one of three forms: septicemia, pneumonic, and the most common, bubonic. Septicemia means blood poisoning. Pneumonic means an illness of the lungs, and bubonic means an illness of the lymph nodes of the armpit or the groin. In recent decades, other suggestions for the cause of the Black Death have been put forward, but the Yersinia pestis theory is the one favoured by most historians. And if it's correct, then the plague was spread by fleas on infected rats. For the 19th century, when the understanding of hygiene had been grasped, towns were highly suited to the spread of plague. But either way, between 1347 and 1351, there was a pandemic in Europe of a disease which was called plague at the time. Descriptions written at the time tell us of the symptoms, and so Giovanni Boccaccio in 1351 in his Decameron wrote, "In men and women alike, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumours in the groin or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. From the two said parts of the body, this deadly gavocilio soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change, black spots or livid making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere, now few and large, now minute and numerous. And as the gavocilio had been and still was an infallible token of approaching death, such also were these spots on whomsoever they showed themselves." And Rosemary Horrocks writes, quoting Ludwig Heiligen, "It is said that the plague takes three forms. In the first, people suffer an infection of the lungs, which leads to breathing difficulties. Whoever has this corruption or contamination to any extent cannot escape, but will die within 2 days. Another form in which boils erupt under the armpits. A third form in which people of both sexes are attacked in the groin." Now, plague may have come into Europe through ships bringing goods from the Crimea or Genoa. Over the next few months, it spread in Italy, and in early 1348 reached Marseille in France via ships from Italy. By June 1348, it had reached England and then spread north through Germany to Scandinavia. Now, we can't be sure exactly how many people who died, since we don't know for sure how many people there were before or after the pandemic. And it seems to have affected the more populated areas more, with some rural areas missing it out altogether. However, estimates of about a third to a half of the population dying are common. 1360 to 1363, 1374, 1400, 1438 to 1439, 1456 to 57, 1464 to 66, 1481 to 85, 1500 to 1503, 1518 to 1531, 1544 to 1548, 1563 to 1566, 1573 to 1588, 1596 to 1599, 1602 to 1611, 1623, 1640, 1644 to 1654, 1644 to 1667, all saw recurrences of the disease with no way to stop it. Quarantine. The idea that you were isolated for a particular period of time was introduced in Ragusa, which is now Dubrovnik in Croatia, and was found to help. but in each outbreak up to 20% of the then population died. What impacts do you think this had? Well, there were changes in funeral practice. We had a breakdown of village society. There were economic impacts, the end of feudalism, because it increased the value of each labourer who was still there. There's a rise in the sense of the individual. If your village society had gone, you were standing alone. There were pressures on the church because prayer hadn't worked to stop it. Monasteries were hit due to contact with the disease. They were there lovingly servicing the disease, and then plague spread through them. We had a rise in the role of laywomen in the church because of the loss of priests. Julian of Norwich lived between 1342 and 1416, and this may well have been the background to her prominence. There was a victimisation. We get the beginning of the witch hunts and persecution of the Jews, finding someone to blame. And that's also a change in inheritance from just the assumption it goes to the eldest son. This is where people start writing down their wills as to what will happen according to who's still alive. One of the impacts of the Black Death was the growth of towns. Although many people in the towns had died, there was still work available there, and at a wage. So where your local village structure had collapsed, although some stayed and worked the land, some moved to the town rather than trying to get the farming going again. And because there was a lack of labourers, wages were high, and so more moved. In this period, whole villages disappeared, not because all had died of the plague, but because those who left had moved away. The start of capitalism. This is the period when what we now know as capitalism really got going. The Oxford Reference Dictionary says, capitalism is an economic system in which the factors of production are privately owned and individual owners of capital are free to make use of it as they see fit, in particular for their own profit. In this system, the market and the profit mechanism will play a major role in deciding what is to be produced, how it is to be produced, and who owns what is produced. Now, the term capitalist first appears in the mid-17th century as someone who has money, goods and assets and uses them to acquire more money, goods and assets. But the roots of capitalism lie much farther back. The term capital, derived from the Latin caput, which means head, first emerged in the 13th century, meaning the money or goods of a trader or a company of traders. Before this time, the economy in Europe was feudal. Now, there'd always been a few people who'd made their living by trade, by buying or bartering the surplus in one area to move to sell or buy or barter the surplus in another area. And in this way, some luxury goods were moved around the world. But the vast majority of people lived on the land in a subsistence lifestyle. Feudalism, which was superimposed in England by the Normans on what was probably a more egalitarian open field system, was the system where nobles were granted land by the crown in exchange for military service. They, in turn, had vassals, people who had land granted by the noble, and in return owed military service to the noble. The land, in turn, was worked by peasants or serfs, and they were tied to their land. They gave their lord homage, labour, and a share of the produce of the land they worked, in return for military protection. Now, two main reasons for the start of capitalism have been suggested. The traditional one is that as soon as you have cities, you have the seeds of capitalism. So as the towns grew under the pressure of the crises of the 14th century, the growth of capitalism was inevitable. If people were to live in the cities, they had to buy their food. They had to get money in exchange for what they could do as skills, so they could then buy the food. Hence capitalism. But another theory is that the roots of capitalism are directly in the changes to how land was held, and occurred as the result of that population drop in the 14th century. See, in the 15th and 16th centuries, the feudal system broke down. Where there'd been a massive loss of population, lords found they no longer had the peasants to work the land. And unless they themselves were going to get their hands dirty, they had to find a way of getting people to come to their land to work it for them. So they discovered if they offered wages, they could attract workers to the area from areas where the population had not dropped so fast. The labourers gave all the produce of the land to the lord, who gave money to the labourers who could then buy produce back, but also buy other things. And those labourers were no longer bound to a particular area. So if the crops failed in one area, they would just move elsewhere. That made them less liable to famine. They could also develop other skills which they could market, so they could be stonemasons. And the desire of the lords for grand houses, castles and churches increased the market for their skills. Then lords found they could rent out farms on their land in return for money rather than produce. And that was a lot more convenient to get the money directly. So tenant farmers came, they employed the labourers, sold the produce for money. They paid the labourers and the landlord in money, and kept the rest for themselves. So we have a change in the system to a system that requires money. Mines and money is our next section. This system required a vast increase in the amount of money in circulation. Now, money had already been used before the 14th century. You know, we find coins from all ages. If you watch The Dig, which is about the dig at Sutton Hoo, finding that amazing ship burial, you'll have noticed the point where they find a Merovingian French coin. In the 14th century, there was about £50,000 of coinage in circulation. Sorry, try that again. In England, at the Norman Conquest, there was about £50,000 of coinage in circulation. But this had risen to over 1 million by 1311. I got that information from Mark Bailey, Population and Economic Resources, in a book edited by Given Wilson and published in 1996. 1311, we have £1 million of circulation, and at this point there's a population collapse through famine and plague. And so the number of coins did not go up, but there were more per person, and so a money system could grow. But to support the use of money, you needed metal, and so mines were developed more fully. Now, the vast majority of coins in medieval Europe were made of silver. The gold florin was introduced in Florence in the 14th century as a way of reducing the number of silver coins needed, but silver was the everyday metal in use. And so if you wanted to increase your wealth, you could either do all the things that people used to do, or you could just mine silver. In Saxony in 1168, silver was found, and a formal system overseeing mines was developed, including mining laws, which were then adopted elsewhere in Europe. Another discovery in 1470 in the Ore Mountains led to another silver rush. Albertine Saxony was governed by a prince known as the Elector, since he was one of the princes who could elect the next Holy Roman Emperor. There were only 7 electors, And they prevented the role of the emperor being strictly hereditary. Now, although in this period the House of Habsburg tended to be elected, it wasn't absolutely certain. And so to be an elector gave extra influence. And since the state was producing more silver and so more coins, he controlled coin production. And so the elector grew more wealthy. And this enabled other things to happen, such as the growth of new universities. Let's pause and come back together and reflect on some of these changes of this period.